I'll try to answer a question Noel asked me about relationship between sound, images, and text. In relationship with the question of what I call the proletarianization of sensibility. What are images, sounds, and text in our current experience? They are object images, recorded sounds, and spatialized languages that are spatialized and detemporalized speeches. A mental image produced by imagination or perception is a temporal one. It is meta-stabilized in the psychical flux or flow of consciousness. Such a mental image can become an object image by a spatialization of this meta-stabilized temporality. A sound is obviously itself temporal, and recorded, it has become a spatial object which can be re-temporalized. All detemporalized and spatialized objects are produced by a process of grammatization, which begins in the prehistorical caves, like this, which is also the beginning of the grammatization, the explicitation, the projection, and the individuation of what I call the archi-cinema of the noetic soul, as it is possible to see it in the recent work published by Mark Azema last year under the title Prehistory of Cinema, in which we can see this image with 200 other images in which you can see that this is higher Paleolithic period, in which you can see that the prehistorical man was already producing the decomposition of movement. This is a running lion of the Chauvet cave, 31,000 years old. Now this process of grammatization, can you see this correctly? Isn't it possible to cut the lights? Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, it's better. Thank you very much. Now this process of grammatization concerns not only images, sounds, and languages, because after this you have hieroglyphic writings, etc., etc. Since the 18th century, gestures and movements of the body are also reproduced, recorded, and transformed by machinic reproduction, from the automate built by Vaucanson to big data, capturing our personal data and passing through tool machines and the assembly lines, which engender what is called proletarianization by Marx. But now, what are becoming and where are proletarianized manual workers? This question makes the context of this question, makes the context of this lecture. A lecture that we could entitle also Questioning Kant's Aesthetic Theory of Judgment in the Time of Generalized Proletarianization. What do I mean saying that? For exploring this question, we must introduce this other question, that is what happened for Marcel Duchamp between this work, artwork, Nude Descending a Staircase, and, which is 1912, and this other one, which is 1917. And why should it matter to us for exploring this question of proletarianization and of aesthetic judgments in the point of view of Kant? Between 1912 and 1917, Duchamp was increasingly concerned with the question of reproducibility. As you can see, it is comparable to what we could see in Chauvet Cave. Duchamp was increasingly concerned with the question of reproducibility that, starting with photography and chronophotography, leads to Frederick Taylor's work, that is, to the ready-made, that is, to the assembly line. The ready-made is born from the serialized production of mass for mass markets, which open up a new question of proletarianization in a new age. I've tried to show in my book De la misère symbolique and symbolic misery, which will be published in English this year, I believe, that at the time of Henry Ford and Edward Bernays, the development of the culture industries lead to a proletarianization of the sensibility of the consumer through the apparatuses for the canalization and reproduction of perception. Bernays, who was Freud's nephew, as you can see it in Freud's museum in London, invented the basics of marketing by organizing the captivation of the consumer's attention, and thus of the libidinal energy that marketing must seek to redirect from the consumer's primordial objects towards the commodities. This process of proletarianization mirrors the way in which the industrial machine era made possible the proletarianization of the producers. It used the term proletarianization here, I use, the term proletarianization here to refer to a loss of knowledge. For Béla Bartók, it is this loss of knowledge that is at stake in the birth of the radio. Like the phonograph, the radio enables one to listen to music without needing to know how to play music. In an interview that Bartók gave in 1937, he said that one should only be allowed to listen to music on the radio if one is reading the musical score at the same time. For him, it is evident that those who do not know how to read or play music cannot really listen to it. The Baron of Caylus says in 1759, in his debate with Denis Diderot, and Goethe will say the same at the end of the 18th century, that it is impossible to speak of a canvas that one has not copied. This is a draw by Goethe. And if one looks at the canvases in which in 1806 Hubert Robert is painting the Louvre that had become a national museum accessible to all just 3 years before, accessible to public, to all, just 3 years before, one can see that the visitors, who are most definitely almost all artists, mostly reproduce paintings there. Paul Cézanne will do the same in the 19th century. As he explains in a letter to Émile Bernard, he thinks that one cannot see that which cannot show by painting it, for example. one only sees to the extent to which one is capable of painting what one sees. One would have to show that what is happening here is a transformation of Jacob von Uexküll's sensory-motor loop. From this moment onwards, it starts looping through artificial organs, thus making possible a noetic expression of sensibility that becomes exclamatory and sensational as a result. The French word sensationnel, meaning in English something like terrific. That is exclamative sensation. That is exteriorized by a word or by a painting or by a gesture. Throughout the 20th century, the development of technologies of what Walter Benjamin, will call mechanical reproducibility leads to a generalized regression of the psychomotive knowledges that were characteristic of art amateurs. This regression is made possible by a mechanical turn of sensibility that leads to a proletarianization of the amateur, so that the latter, having lost her or his knowledges, becomes a cultural consumer, at times even turning into what Hannah Arendt calls a cultivated Philistine. These questions, and the question that the artist Marcel Duchamp raises about the aim of the artwork in what he characterizes as the time of the proletarianization of the artists themselves. It is noted in his notebooks during the period of Fontaine, confront us today in an entirely new context that is almost the inverse of the time that Marcel Duchamp is talking about, namely in a time in which a second mechanical turn of sensibility is taking place. This second turn is made possible by digital technologies, through which just about anyone can access technologies of captivation, post-production, indexation, diffusion, annotation, and promotion, technologies that were, until now, industrial functions that were hegemonically controlled by what I have called the psycho-power of marketing and the culture industries. This new mechanical turn of sensibility, which is no longer analogical but digital, leads to a renaissance of the figure of the amateur. That is to say, to a reconstitution of libidinal energy, which, after being systematically canalized and rerouted by consumerist organization, ended up putting in place an economy of drives. That is to say, a libidinal diseconomy, a destruction of the libidinal economy. What is an amateur if not a figure of a libidinal economy? The amateur loves. Amat, from the Latin verb amare means to love. That's what makes an amateur an amateur. Art amateurs love works of art. And insofar as they love them, these artworks work on them. That is to say, the amateur is transformed by them, individuated by them, for speaking with the verb of Simondon. In order for a work of art, any work of art, to present itself as such, namely as a work of art, one must believe in it. Believe in it as a work, and as a work of art. The work of art only works as art to the extent that one believes in it. For example, a fountain as an artwork. In a way, Immanuel Kant was already saying this. The reflexivity of aesthetic judgment as a judgment that cannot be proven and that could therefore never be apodictic, that is demonstrated, is, at least from this point of view, something that presupposes a kind of belief. It is as if each work of art were, in a way, its own deictic and not apodictic revelation, like in a religious sense of revelation, and could only manifest itself as work by presenting itself as such a revelation, thereby forming a sort of dogma, which in some cases has constituted schools, chapels, churches, and has even led to schisms. When I consider a work to be beautiful, I necessarily think that everyone should find it beautiful, Kant says, as you know. However, in the intimacy of my thoughts, I know that this is not the case, and that it will never be the case. This is also to say that the work's beauty will never be recognized. If to recognize means to establish as true, as in to prove or to demonstrate. Aesthetic judgment will always remain a state of my belief, which could possibly be shared more largely, for example, by my friends, or even by my age, as fashion or as a received idea. The object of aesthetic judgment, however, will always and literally remain improbable. That is, unprovable. Whether it is individual or collective, the aesthetic judgment is always of this order. It is, as it is said by Kant, a reflexive judgment, and not a determinate one, a subjective judgment and not an objective one, which means that it is of the order of a belief, which is also the mode of being of the experience of art in general. In the 20th century, this belief develops a new but essential link to a sort of scandal. That is to say, to a sort of trap and reversal. Scandalon in Greek means trap. This link is formed from the 19th century onwards with Olympia, for example, as you know, the title of this famous painting by Manet, and also the name of the animated doll in Ernst Hoffmann, The Sandman. The story that is of central importance to Freud's analysis of the uncanny, excuse me, and the link with scandal becomes explicit with Dadaism. This new kind of belief, which one could call reverse belief, expresses itself in competing churches and chapels. Some are more dogmatic than others, and a few are schismatic even, that one can call tastes or movements. However, these tastes or movements are trans-individuations of the social, to the extent that one understands the social as a process of a psychic and collective individuation, following Gilbert Simondon. It seems to be the case, then, that reflexive judgment is not only shared, but also constructed, that it comes about through various artifices, and that this artifactual formation of judgment and its reflexivity can become a dimension of art itself. Not only a dimension, but the very form of art's working even. It can become a sort of social sculpture, for speaking with Joseph Beuys. Now, it is in exactly the same way that art becomes a part of the global development of highly speculative marketing. One can thus see appear marketing techniques like the buzz, which is also a modality of psychopower. Such marketing techniques exploit the reflexive and inevitably auto-subjective dimension of individual as well as collective judgment. The mystagogy of art thus finds itself threatened by that to which, in this case, it comes very close, that is, mystification. All of this follows from that one could call a pharmacology of the social sculpture, from a mystagogy that always confronts the risk of mystification, a mystification that this pharmacology turns into its working material. And this confrontation does not start with Joseph Beuys, but with Marcel Duchamp. All of this raises a question about the instrumental and technical condition of the noetic act that is called very generally a belief. This question needs to be asked anew in a time when contemporary art, like religion, has some who are superstitious, as well as some who are bigots, fanatics, Gnostics, and agnostics. The mysteries of art always pass through the instruments of this art, in the same way that they are instruments of a cult. And a specific problem of modern art and contemporary art is the ever-increasing obsolescence of these instruments. I'm thinking here not only of techniques, and in particular the techniques practiced by artists, but also of organizations, insofar as they are part of what I call a general organology. That is to say, of institutions, for example, the Pompidou Center. A work only works to the extent that one believes in it. More precisely, a work only works to the extent that it affects us, in the sense that suddenly it jumps out at us. Such a jumping out only affects us and gets us hooked to the extent that it directs us towards a mystery. It reveals next to existence, next to its own existence, first and foremost, but also next to that of its author and of its spectator, something other than the plane of existence, if one believes in it. The experience of art is the experience of a work that opens up onto such a plane, and that appears in this way to reveal this other plane. every work of art has the structure of a revelation. Any sensible subject that is gifted with a supra-sensible faculty can have this exclusively and irreducibly subjective experience. Kant argues it to be analogous to the moral law in terms of the encounter with the sensible aesthetics. He calls it an aesthetic judgment. It makes appear in the most ordinary way in the world the extraordinary next to this ordinary, and as coming out of this ordinary, but also, and at the same time, as something that can never be proven. Instead, it can only be experienced. Let's say that the mysterious is the name of the extraordinary, and that there is a mystagogical performativity of the work, which only works on this condition. Insofar as the mystery of the ordinary goes, the work initiates one to another plane, and in this way it constitutes an address, that is to say, a destination. This dimension, which is not that of existence, even though it does not come from an elsewhere or from a world beyond existence either, leaps forth from immanence and into it. It is this fully immanent projection that forms the basis of the question of reflexive judgment, in the sense that such a judgment cannot be reduced or compared to objective determinations. That is to say, to objects of determinate and cognitive judgment. The cognitive is never mysterious. The reflexive, on the other hand, is the mystery of the extraordinary itself, but of an extraordinary without transcendence. In this sense, it is the mystery of immanence itself, the becoming profane of the world. That is to say, it's becoming ordinary, whence the fact that a reflexive judgment is only universal by default, by what I call default. I maintain in English défaut in French because it's impossible to translate it in English, in the correct English. I'm sorry. Its universality, the fact that I posit that everyone should find beautiful and not merely pleasant what I find beautiful, that everyone should find extraordinary what is also ordinary, is its very mystery, precisely because of the fact that it only imposes itself by defaulting itself. One will never be able to prove this universality. It will forever remain fundamentally doubtful. This being by default, or that which is called beautiful for Kant, and more generally the content of every aesthetic judgment, thus joins up with the intrinsically idiomatic character of language. There is no universal language, and every idiom comes about through a default, through a fault that is unworked, defaulted of language. In the eyes of those who do not speak the language, for example, idioms come about through the fault of pronunciation, as it is developed by Derrida. That is also why a work of art is always idiomatic, born from the fault and the default of of language in general, of the language. For example, the language of God, A language only speaks if it makes faults and defaults. As default, by making a default or defaults. A language, as opposed to language in general, to the language, is that which gives speech to a shibboleth, for speaking with the Bible and Derrida, which is a fault of pronunciation. It's the mysteries of language and the precarious capacity of poetry that turn such a fault into the very thing that is needed, into a default that is necessary. For speaking with Gilles Deleuze, a quasi-causality of the default. For example, with Joël Bousquet, the French poet, surrealist poet. This necessary accident reveals itself in each work of art as the jumping out of a singularity that is literally improbable, unprovable, and that goes much further than a simple provable universality, provable as apodictic universality, which can, in this respect, be subsumed under the concept of a determinate judgment. That such singularity opens up another dimension, another plane, means that this dimension, this plane, is that which spontaneously leaps forth from any desire, to the extent that desire renders its objects infinite as the objects of a singularity. The plane of consistency to which the mystagogy of art refers is a lyre that exists among other planes of consistency, and without which no object of any type of work, whether it be the work of science, philosophy, literature, law, politics, or knowledge in general, could consist. That is to say, impose itself to existence as that which, even though it cannot be the object of a calculation, is that without which existence would undo itself. Without it, those who still attempt to exist will be brought down to the level of subsistences, that is to say, of the drives. The reflexive judgment by which Kant characterizes as aesthetic judgment is thus nothing but a reflexive modality of relation to this other plane that subtends the entire activity of the spirit, and that can't be reduced by any kind of knowledge, not even apodictic, cognitive, and determinate knowledge. Apodictic thinkers or dialecticians, as Plato and Aristotle called them, are interested in working on the conditions in which one can put at a distance and contemplate the exists, and thus pass from monstration to demonstration, from showing to demonstrating. However, these conditions are themselves monstrative. They are themselves of the order of showing. They cannot be demonstrated or proven. They are what one calls axioms. They are the object of so-called esoteric philosophical teachings that are more like initiations than like education, properly speaking. Education is exoteric by nature and not esoteric. If the axiomatic is that which cannot be demonstrated or proven, while at the same time being the condition of all demonstration, the axiom is that which is likely but can never be posited as true. Does this mean that it is an object of belief? To say so would be a mistake, because this belief only presents itself as axiom on the basis of a kind of evidence. This means, however, that it is also the object of a judgment by default. And it is this kind of evidence by default that founds the reflexivity of aesthetic judgment. Isn't it evidence itself, then, that constitutes a kind of mystery? How to separate between the necessary mystagogy that would underlie and support the life of spirit in all of its aspects, as the shadow of the light that this life brings, and the workings of all kinds of mystification and obscurantism that are the price one has to pay for it, but that are similar to the fox in the hen house. This intrinsic ambiguity of the life of the spirit requires a critic of all mystagogies, not in order to denounce them, but to discern within them that which is always at risk of developing into mystification, and which makes possible the cultural Philistinism that Hannah Arendt analyzes through the figure of the cultivated Philistine. Plato never sets foot on this construction site, even though he invests the authority of Socrates in the mysterious diotima. Plato thinks he is free from mystification because he denounces the mysteries of art, music, and poetry. It is also tendency towards mystification, and the mystification that all mystagogy carries within it, all philosophy, all art, all religion, that produces priests who suddenly no longer believe, while they continue to do their job, priests and professors. Plato's essence, Kant's transcendental, the object of Freud's desire, all of these come from such a mystery. All of these are the extraordinary that a narrow-minded rationalism thinks it can and must eliminate. The excuse being that the extraordinary is indeed always also, but not only, the reign of simulators. I'm speaking here of belief insofar as belief refers to an object that is not on the plane of existence. Because one can also believe that behind this door, for example, there is a corridor. But that is an entirely different kind of belief. The belief I have in mind is therefore not a belief of existence. Instead, it irreducibly consists of putting an object on another plane and of believing in this other plane through these very acts. In the most banal structure there is, its logic is that of desire giving itself an object and elevating it to the status of being the object of this desire. An object that can only be desired to the extent that it is not calculable, and that therefore incomparable, unprovable. Seen from this angle, it is not an object that exists. if it is true that only that which is provable and calculable exists, according to Newton, for example. It's exactly the same when, if I judge something to be beautiful, I include in my judgment that everyone ought to find it beautiful. But, when I love a being and I desire it, I include in my judgment the presumption that the entire world ought to love and desire this being. Even though I know very well that this is not the case. Desire in this case, which is not drive, is not on the plane of the drives. Desire universalizes its objects. The drive, on the other hand, tends toward the consumption of an object. The latter does not include auto-universalization. Desire is to the drive what the beautiful is to that which is merely pleasant, if we follow Kant. We are living in a time of lovelessness. The time of a libidinal economy that is constituted in such a way that, with capitalism having put desire at the center of its energy, this economy has led to the ruin of desire, to the unchaining of its drives, and to the liquidation of philia, and more generally, of this love that the noetic souls have to have for each other and for the objects of their world. When they are religious, these souls consider such objects to be the expression of God's infinite goodness. They are the indicators of this goodness as a sublime source of all love. God thus constitutes the objects of all desires. Love, or to use a less specifically Western and Christian term, desire, constitutes philia, in the sense of Aristotle. This is also how love constitutes individuation. It only follows its course on the psychic plane to the extent that it also inscribes itself on the collective plane. It is through love that the end of psychic and collective individuation is formed in the expression by Simoneau, psychic and collective individuation. At the first and preliminary condition of this individuation, love is that which needs to be maintained through care, through those practices of care that make possible the access to consistencies that exist on the plane of the extraordinary. And that, because they do not exist, are intrinsically doubtful and unprovable. Works, for example artworks, are such practices of care. But they themselves need to be taken care of. One must be initiated into these objects that are themselves initiatory. It is how the magnetic chain and field that Socrates talks about in Plato's ion are formed. The question of access to the works is what one has called in the era of the cultural industries and in the cultural democracies, cultural mediation. A highly institutionalized way of referring to the question of address, which I raised earlier on. The question of access, however, is a question of mystagogy. It is a question of the initiation into a mystery that an artwork is intrinsically. insofar as it projects those that it affects into another plane, a plane that is itself improbable and intrinsically mysterious, at least in view of the planes of ordinary existence, and even more so of subsistence. The question of this access is raised in each society, whether it is embodied by the shaman, the warrior who enters into the plane of the consistency that is her or his liberty, the official, the master, the artist, or the institution. However, in modern art, this question comes to count in a new way and following something like a fault line. This is the price one must pay, and it's high price, for the death of God. It's a costly fault of a price one gets through the death of God, and as the trophy for this chasing out of the sacred. That is to say, of the extraordinary insofar as it is separate, sacred. Such a chasing out amounts to a state of disenchantment, in which modern art constitutes itself as the mystery of the profane, and no longer as the sacred, at the affirmation within this immanence that the disenchanted world has become of a consistency next to existence, as something from where a new plane is set free. That is what Charles Baudelaire says, and he is thinking of Constantin Guis and Manet. It's a plane of consistency that Gilles Deleuze talks about as belief in the world, in the second volume on cinema. It's a mystagogy of immanence. To believe in the world, in this world, as Deleuze says, to believe in this world, one needs a plane of consistency. Existence will never suffer because of belief. This belief in consistency, which is not simply the belief in existence that makes me believe that there is something behind every door like this one, is indissociable from reason understood as motive. Reason in French, la raison, is a motive. It works also in English. It doesn't work in German. In French, the word for reason, raison, refers also to the motivation that produces movement. Belief looks for the motive, which is in turn constituted by belief. This mystagogy is a transductive relation, for speaking with Simondon. That is a relation which constitutes the terms. I can only desire that in which I believe. The object of my desire becomes immediately, to the extent that I desire it, the object of my belief in its infinity. And this goes both ways. I can only believe in what I desire infinitely. Aristotle calls this desire theos. Theos is the impassive and inaccessible object of all desires. In this respect, it is non-existent. Everything that exists is passive, that is to say, corruptible, or sublunary, as Aristotle says. Theos is the object of the contemplation theorein, in Greek, of the noetic souls, insofar as the desire, the contemplation through which they pass on to and elevate themselves towards the plane of the extraordinary. But this theos is not at all the one of monotheism. It is the object of contemplation. That is of desire. Today, in a time of lovelessness, it often becomes more and more difficult to say that one loves a work, an artwork. One finds this or that interesting. It's interesting. That is a type of postmodern judgment, neither negative nor positive, that appears to be typical of the cultivated Philistine, and that one hears more and more. A mediocre judgment, mediocris, in the narrow sense of the word, as referring to the average judgment of the average person, subjected to the averages of modern mass society. A work only works on the condition that the curiosity, the interest it sparks, in the first instance transforms itself into mystery and lifts itself onto a higher plane. As the Goncourt brothers said about a work by Chardin, at a certain moment the painting is elevated. It is a quotation of Daniel Arras explaining his relationship to artworks. He says, suddenly the work is elevated. The work only works on the condition that simple interest gives way, and possibly immediately afterwards, it gives way to surprise, to being taken by surprise. It is in surprise and through surprise that a passion of the work happens, so that the work produces a sort of levitation. That is to say, the thought of miracle by which all true admiration is triggered. There is a unity of the history of artistic mystagogy. It manifests itself when I, experiencing one of these mysteries that one calls works, or even a series of such mysteries that they are presented in museums, expositions, or galleries, suddenly find myself in a state of levitation. And in a way that is unexpected and that I cannot take in, which is incomprehensible. I am passing on to the other plane, a plane where an overtaking, let's say an over-prehension, if a surprise is something like a prehension, in French, surprise, it's a prehension, which is, I would say, by producing a French neologism, a surpréhension, not a comprehension, a plane where a being overtaken overcomes or surpasses all comprehension. This can happen through the black cow in the caves of Lascaux, or through Greek marble, a portrait of Rembrandt and the initiatory path that is formed and that I traverse, discovering the monogrammatic monography of a contemporary artist, an artist of my time who transindividuates the time in which she or he is working. This is a suspension, an epoche, because it is epoch-making. Precisely, Marcel Duchamp is an epoch maker. It becomes one of my epochs. I am transformed by such a surprise, such an overtaking. And what follows from it is what Gilbert Simondon calls a quantum leap in individuation. It can also constitute an epoch in art history or in the history of an artist in what one calls her or his work. The scandal is itself a sort of social levitation, preceded by a fall, hence the initial the initial meaning of the Greek word scandalon, trap. At first, and insofar as it involves a process, the scandal is not psychically and individually experienced as a levitation. On the contrary, it consists, first of all, and in a way negatively, in a collapse. It is a kind of being overtaken of surprise and over-apprehension, but this is presented as the incapacity of taking something in sooner, and rather than as that by which one is taken over, and as that which goes against all interests, as well as all access to the supra-sensible, and that which is shocking and slaps public opinion in the face by going against its interests, and that which is not at all interesting, unworthy of interests, and in this respect, demoralizing. It is only in the aftermath of a scandal and through a work of collective individuation, that is to say, of trans-individuation, that a surprise, an overtaking, which is an epoch, that is to say, a suspension and an interruption which lifts us up, is produced. This aftermath of the scandal is, in this case as well, a sort of collective levitation. But it only comes about through something like a work of mourning. This is why one can never say that the mystagogy, that is a work during the opening of an art show, is merely a mystification. Contemporary art, which proceeds from the scandal through which modern art comes about, and thus reaches its completion through a sort of trap, requires an aftermath to which its scandalous origin gives it a right. An aftermath that is, in a way, a priori. This aftermath is that of the transformation of psychic and collective individuation, through which the scandalous mystagogist, the one who brings to light the mystagogical character of art as such, sculpts the social. All the same, the question is raised of knowing to what extent a contemporary mystagogy is still possible. If it is true that now the adjective contemporary, now in our times, and now at this step of my lecture, means without scandal. Contemporary means without scandal. It's impossible to provoke a scandal today. There used to be a time of the scandal, a time when transgression produced a scandal. But this is no longer the case. It's as if there no longer were any possibilities for transgression. As if one could no longer expect anything from transgression or from a mystery. As if there no longer were a mystery. Our time is a time in which the mafia and the oligarchies remorselessly chase out the bourgeoisie. A bourgeoisie that, although it is Philistine, is still too cultivated in their eyes. Levitation through which a work appears to me as work and lifts itself can only come about as belief. This belief is a desire where a judgment is formed. To judge a work is to love or not to love it. And this is why such a judgment is made by an amateur. Amateurs have made art history, and in the most diverse ways. Now, there are many instances in which one can absolutely no longer say, with respect to contemporary artworks, whether one loves them or whether one doesn't. In these cases, loving no longer has any meaning. In this case, one is tempted to give the assessment that I called mediocre. It's interesting, or it's not interesting. This is a mediocrity for which, as Philistine as it may be, one should not have any contempt, for who can today completely escape the destiny of the cultivated Philistine? Nobody. It develops in time, and as the very suffering that Axel Honneth calls Mishartung, which is translated in French by the word mépris, contempt. It means literally a mistake, a taking wrongly, and needs to be inscribed in this sense in the series of terms I used earlier on, to take in comprehension, or to be taken over by something, surprise, apprehension, etc. When art becomes transgression, in other words, in the first stage of the larger becoming attitude, that with which art works is no longer matter, it is that with which art works is no longer matter, it is individuation. This requires one to think a hyper-matter rather than something immaterial. And I will need to come back to this. Art takes advantage in every possible way of the fact that in individuation, which is a current, a flux, a process, forms lose and change form and are flowing along, and that these forms are always already materials. Pigments, marble, bronze, photographs, canvas for a painting, paper for newspapers, industrial materials, glass, entirely finished objects, rails, apparatuses, dispositives, devices. All sorts of instances that can become the object of individuation. That is to say, of that which can spatialize time. Such is the role of what I call tertiary retentions. They specify, like traces, the texture of the end of the psychic and collective individuation, which is woven by the retentional devices, apparatuses, and institutions. Having become transgression and then attitude as psychosocial individuation, which is made up of attitude, and is in this sense the hypermatter par excellence. Art is a modality of transformation, which is what individuation is by general principle, but it has become so according to conditions that change with time. The materials of transgression are all the more transgressive when in the industrial and then hyper-industrial activity they are no longer simply materials with which one can produce forms. Individuation comes about in function of dynamic constraints that are induced by a general organology that results in a genealogy of the sensible. At a time when a scandal turns out to be a technique of social sculpturing, that is to say, a new process of individuation, reproducibility which substitutes the matrix and the apparatus of captivation for the form, does not only affect after language has already been turned into letters and become printed, the audiovisual works of art such as photography and cinema, but also and first and foremost all of our everyday objects coming from serialized productions. It marks a change in the general regime of reproduction that constitutes a new industrial totality of tertiary retentions, one that begins with the grammatization of the gestures of the workers themselves. The conditions of transindividuation are organological. They pass through the organs of perception, but then endlessly recombine the assemblages of these organs through technical mediations. This can happen, for example, by artificially bringing together the ear and the hand through the musical instrument, by an organon that is an artifact, or by bringing together, before art history, in the narrow sense of the word, the eye, the mouth, and the hand of the artist who uses the straw to blow pigments in the wall inside the caves of Lascaux. Art history is also the history of these assemblages, in the sense that painters see with their hands, and that musicians, after the appearance of the 19th century of the diastematic notation of pitches and rhythms, hear with their eyes. These assemblages pass through organic defunctionalization and refunctionalizations of both the sense organs and the artificial organs and organizations. And all of this constitutes itself parallel to that by which the process of grammatization through which the continuous is separated begins. This continuous of speech, of gestures, of the perceived, visible, and audible, separated into recombinable elements that can be put together in different ways. In this aspect, the continuous is workable. It is a work of art through this very dimension. The defunctionalizations and refunctionalizations that determine the rhythm of the organological genealogy of the sensible and of what is in love there, the intellect and the unity of its reasons, its motivations, have specific factors, ways that create ruptures that are called epochs, and that accentuate more and more vividly as time moves on the fault lines, the disadjustments, the incomprehensions, the crises and critiques. During the more than 30,000 years that separate us from the Chauvet cave, the first musical instruments are said to date from this age as well, this genealogy, which begins from the start of humanization more than 2 million years earlier, amounts through grammatization to an industrial group of apparatuses, of which the mechanical turn as well as a turn of the sensibility of the spirit in its totality are born, with all their dimensions having become objects of calculability, that is to say, of determination, of what Kant calls a determinate judgment. It is only within such a turn that an event as extraordinary as Fontaine can come about between 1917 and 1963, the year when the circuit of its transindividuation entered it into art history, and as the origin of what one would call today contemporary art. At this stage of its genealogy, which is also the stage of captivation and of the systematic detour of libidinal energy through the audiovisual powers that are organized in the cultural industry as the flow of temporal objects obsessed with attention in the service of the nascent consumerist economy. The organs of perception end up becoming elements of organological sets that are industrially reconfigured, and in which the apparatuses come first as apparatuses of perception, of psychic apparatuses, and as technical apparatuses and social apparatuses as well. And it is in this new game that transindividuation is at work, when it works. Artists work with all these apparatuses, with this material producing all sorts of retentional materials. Surrealism works with the psychic apparatus, which has an unconscious. Expressionism with the mnesic apparatus, where phenomena are transformed. The phenomenological apparatus that Paul Klee describes at the beginning of his theory of modern art, and that continues in Beuys' work. Pop art works with the apparatus of the mass media, etc. All of this brings us back to the question of a general organology, in which the apparatuses of perception are re-examined, explored, reallocated, and possibly also closed down in the context of experiences that have profoundly changed these apparatuses' organological activity as well as their organological status. Thank you very much for your attention.
Any questions? Okay, I think we have about 15 minutes set aside, and we'll see where the discussion goes. Any quick takers? Tim?
Thank you, Bernard. Just to come back to lovelessness, there's a famous essay by, well, relatively famous essay by Umberto Eco, where he defines the postmodern as no longer being able to say I love you, because you know that Barbara Cartland has already written these words. So there's a sense in which, you know, it's already cliched, there's already this term itself, which is the expression of love, it's already a cliche. But he then does go on to give a few options. You know, you might say to your loved one, as Barbara Cartland would write, I love you, let's say, etc. So you can take on this kind of distance towards the statement itself, which seems to kind of regain it. So I guess what I'm getting at is that even if it seems that ironic detachment from things like declarations of love describes to us a situation of lovelessness, it perhaps doesn't. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I'm just trying to push you a little bit on your diagnosis of lovelessness as our current situation.
Before trying to do that, to do this, I must recall precise what is the status of love in my reading of Freud. As you know, when Sigmund Freud discovered the question of death drive, that is in 1920, he completely reorganized his topic, his libidinal economy, and he produced a new definition of what is libido, in which he says libido is not drive. Libido is made by drives, but libido is a deterring of the goals of drives. And it is, for example, if you don't have a kind of desexualization of sexual drive, you don't have libido in the sense of love. And he says, you always have something like a process of idealization of the object of desire, and if you don't have this, it is not a libidinal economy as such. It is not reachable. So, I believe that we have to reinterpret and to redefine those words. Even the word God, when we say that we speak after the death of God. When I use the word love, I try to avoid a Christianic stereotypical use of this word, but I believe that it is impossible to separate our definition of love to a critique of Christianism. And this is impossible to do without rereading, for example, Max Weber and the relationship between love, faith, calculation, investment, etc., etc., in which, for example, Weber says, at the beginning of capitalism is an investment in the sense of the object of desire, which is a sublimated object, which is the love for Jesus Christ. And this is described by Max Weber as a paradoxical situation in which the faith, the Christian faith, for example, is transformed into confidence, and the confidence is destroying the faith. And it is not possible to maintain confidence without a kind of faith. Why? Because for having credit, confidence, credit, and belief, for example, belief into the future of capitalism or the future of the technological society, etc., you must have something which escapes to calculation, which is not calculable. This is very well known, but if we can revisit these questions of lovelessness through, for example, an analysis of the economic crisis, in which you can see that today the main problem of our contemporary society is that there is no credit, because there was a reduction of all projects, for example, the project of the first capitalist entrepreneur for Max Weber, to a calculation. And Weber says the entrepreneur was not at all somebody who wanted to win money. He was carrying a project, a religious project of transformation of the society behind the discourse of Luther and Calvin. Even if it is an ideal type, how do you say that in English? Ideal type? Yes. It is an ideal type, Max Weber says, that's clear. But this is the structural organization of this society. Now, the paradox described by Weber as what he calls secularization, necessarily secularized destruction of faith by confidence, and confidence destroyed by bureaucracy, etc., etc. We must reinterpret this in the 20th century, which was not the century of Max Weber, because he was describing the 19th century. The work of Weber is of 1905. Today we have to revisit this after the experience of the capture of desire with cultural industries, with extremely powerful means. which produce the same problem, but not in the libido of the capitalists, that is the entrepreneur, but in the libido of the consumers. So, if you prefer, I try to, what I call love here, and I use this word because I wanted to radicalize the analysis of Kant, which I criticize on another way, but I couldn't develop this critique today. I wanted to show that when you have something like individuation, you have necessarily always a process of identification to an object with which you can identify yourself by a projection, which is always the structure described by Freud in 1923 as an object of love, that is, as he said, sublimation, idealization, etc., etc. And the problem for me with the Freudian analysis, not only Freudian, but also Lacanian and, let's say, psychoanalytic analysis of these questions, is that they don't see, particularly Freud and Lacan, the organological conditions of this investment. Love is a production of not only a libidinal economy, but an organological economy, that is a pharmacological economy. What is ironic when we refer to love, the irony which is produced by the cultivated Philistines for me, this irony is the one who says, but love doesn't exist. It's pure fantasy. And it is clear that it is pure fantasy. But if you have read, for example, Paul Valéry shows that spirit, or mind, is a pure fantasy produced by what he calls a political economy of spirits, which is producing capitalism, etc., etc. For apprehending these questions in a non-naive way, we need to make a critique of psychoanalysis on the basis of what I tried to show with my commentary of Winnicott, which shows that, for me, you have an organology of the building of desire, that is of the psychic apparatus of the baby, of the infant, which is a transitional object, and where he says an artwork is a transitional object which works for everybody, not only for children, and which continue to work for all generations after generations, etc., etc. And here you have an organology of desire, which become possible, but in which, as it is shown by Winnicott extremely clearly, he says, first, the relationship to the transitional object is addictive. It is a process of addiction. And second, this addiction can become good for the individuation of the baby, or that is curative, and it becomes the construction of himself by identification, etc. Or it can become toxic, that is depriving the baby of its individuation and making him dependent to the individuation of mother, etc., etc. So the question is the pharmacology of what I call love, which is behind the question of love is the question of infinitization and idealization. This is the reason for which we must revisit these questions with the Symposium by Plato. And personally, in the enterprise mentioned by Noel, pharmacon.fr, which is an online course on philosophy, I tried to show that the beginning of what is called metaphysics by Heidegger or Derrida is after the Symposium. until the symposium, Plato is still, for me, in the pre-Socratic tradition, or the tragic tradition, in which the mystery of eros, let's say, is irreducible, and the condition of knowledge that is non-knowledge, as it is claimed by Socrates, because it is completely linked. The knowledge of Socrates is non-knowledge because it is a knowledge in the condition of diotima, that is Lacan would say a lack. I prefer to say a default of knowledge. So after this, it is Phaedrus, and with Phaedrus, it is finished. Knowledge is not at all infinitization. Knowledge is not at all love. It becomes calculation. This is what is at stake in the comment of the Republic by Heidegger, when he says, aletheia becomes orthotes, that is exactitude, calculation, etc. So it's a vast question, but
Any more? Aoife, first.
Yeah, just a quick question. I just wanted if you could clarify for me your kind of standpoint on mystification. So I couldn't, are you kind of for it or against it, or more that there needs to be a new kind of form of mystification? Or just
excuse me, I couldn't.
mystification.
Yeah.
You talked about mystification. I couldn't quite get if you were saying if it was a kind of good or a bad thing, or more that we need to kind of define it on different terms now.
It's impossible to reduce the
Yeah.
possibility of mystification, and mystification is not a bad thing. It is the destiny of mystagogy. And the problem of mystification is not a substantial question, it is a question of relationship. The problem is, how will you make the possibility to an artwork, for example, to work? An artwork of an installation, or you can call that a performance. You can call that as you want. What is at stake for me behind this question of the irreducible pharmacological dimension of mystagogy, if you want, is a political question. Is the one I consider to be not mediation, not the question of mediation, but the question of therapeutic. I say that because I spent a lot of time in the Pompidou Center and in the museum, in Pompidou Center, in Le Louvre, everywhere. You have services for mediation to the public, for explaining how works work. It's impossible to explain. And it's absolutely stupid to propose an explanation of this. It's precisely, the question is not to explain, it is to make the proof of the non-explainable dimension of words, and of what I call overprehension or surprehension. Now, this always creates the possibility of mystification. Mystification is not necessarily a voluntary mystification. For example, the so-called Philistines are not voluntarily mystificators. They mystify themselves, but they would like to avoid to mystify themselves. They don't, and they are not conscious of this mystification. But it's not a question of will. It is a question of politics. That is, or what I call a general organology. What I call general organology is a point of view on these questions and other questions. Let's say the question of the material evolution of spirit and mind. Not only with artworks, it is also with scientific work, and political works, and all the projections of humankind, if you want. It's in this point of view, you can't separate the questions of of the psychosomatic conditions, the technological and artifactual organs, and the social organizations. It's impossible to separate the three. Today, we have a situation, a very specific situation, because the art is coming from the 19th century, but it is above all in the 20th century that it is the case, is a transgressive one, and it is in a disadjustment with the social organizations. And marketing exploits this disadjustment for manipulating this. When I say manipulating, it is not for making the marketing the devil, you know, it's not the case for me. But there is a lack of, let's say, politicization of these questions today, which allows this kind of composition. So I believe that we have to revisit, and this is the reason for which, for me, Joseph Beuys is so important. But Duchamp too, he is also in this question of therapeutics. We have to rethink the question of art as a question of therapeutics, of care, and not in the sense we should mediate the arts, the artworks. No, it is not. We don't have to mediate the artworks for the public, which is too stupid for understanding. No, a museum is a process of, must take care of works, you know. And this is, it's impossible to define this in the absolutes, because the care is what must deal with the pharmacon that an artwork is, that a museum is, etc. So it is a question of pharmacology. And this is the reason for which Joseph Beuys speaks always of the shamanic situation. He says, I am in a shamanic situation with my artworks, etc.
Pascal.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for a very provocative talk, as
Thank you.
indeed your work, written work is. My question, well, actually, no, start mentioned about a coincidence. Mine is a little bit quite linked to the last question, because it really is. As I read your work, you know, it's quite, you know, you're very emphatic that it's systemic and the pharmacon is you know, it's across the system and so forth. It's nice though to see some little chinks of where things might change, some little bits of light come in and so forth. So I wonder if you have any idea about where the light might now shine, and is there still a role for art as a domain, you know, amongst compared to the other domains of works and of knowledge is, of art and artists today to play a role, to play a liberatory role out of this?
Today?
Yes, today.
Absolutely. I believe that today we are living it's difficult to avoid stereotypical words, but let's say I will use stereotypes, but we are living a real organological revolution, in which the only possibility of it is a very specific revolution, because what I call tertiary tensions have become the main stake for industry, not only with personal data, etc., but everything is now a question of tracking. And when I finished my lecture today by trying to draw very briefly how we could analyze through surrealism, expressionism, pop art, etc. It was always in relationship with memory. And I believe that art is always the experience and the experience of artificial memory. of artifactual and pharmacological memory. Now we are entering into an absolutely new relationship to memory. And what I call memory being here tertiary retentions. The question is how to articulate, to arrange the relationship between the psychosomatic and the social with these new tertiary retentions. And for this, it is absolutely clear for me that first, the question is, which is at stake, is the one pointed out by Deleuze, how to believe in this world, immanent world. If we can't believe in it, it will be impossible to live in it. Impossible. Or in a way which will not be alive, but a nightmare. And the second question is that for this we must reinvent sensibility. As it was said by Nietzsche. Nietzsche said the question of nihilism will be the invention. To overcome nihilism will consist in the invention of a new sensibility. Now the question is, what shall we call an artist? Because, as you know that better than me, artist is a very historical figure. And even maybe we should abandon the word, because artist, art, etc. There is so much coding, overcoding on those words that it makes impossible to maybe to use them. This is the reason for which I prefer to speak of therapists. What new kind of therapy of the sensible should we develop? And what kind of new, I would not say psychotherapy, but social therapy could be developed by the ones we can continue to call artists, but the ones who are in charge of collective individuation. Because Duchamp is producing a new epoch of individuation. And an artist is the one for who his or her psychic individuation is immediately a social individuation. That is clear that if you like, for example, or if you love Picasso is producing a work, is immediately producing a new stage of its epoch. Not only epoch of painting, but the epoch of the 20th century is the epoch of Picasso. Exactly like Leonard is producing an epoch, etc. And now, what I want to emphasize by saying this is that the question is a social therapy in which the artist is the maker of a collective individuation. And not only himself, he's a maker with priests in the time of Leonard, with philosophers in the 19th century, etc., etc. Even with the economic agents, etc. But is a dimension by which the sensible can individuate itself in a new stage of organology, what I call the genealogy of the sensible. And today it is clear that it is extremely necessary to develop it. But it is a question of political economy. And it is a new kind of political economy, because in this political economy you need to develop there also an organology of this political economy. In my last book, dedicated to the National Front, on the pharmacology of the National Front, I tried to reread the German ideology by Marx and Engels, and to show, and to see myself, that the beginning of Marx and Engels' work was the explanation of the organological dimension of the human life. But after, at the beginning of the Capital, after the Grundrisse, they lost this topic, and it became a much more economical question of capitalism, of capital, of banks, etc., etc. But at the beginning of their work, it was an organological meditation of organization. And we must re-articulate the contemporary situation with this stage of the beginning, the primordial Marxism, if you can say that. And this is a question now for art, let's say.
Okay, one more. Last one, I think, Glenn, go for it.
Yeah, I suppose I'm wondering if you advocate the figure of the amateur, what does that mean for institutions like this which are supposed to produce professionals?
That's an important question. For me, a good professional is an amateur. I know, as you know, maybe you know the expression by Jean-Luc Godard, les professionnels de la profession. No? You don't know that. The professionals of the profession. He said that when he received in the Festival de Cannes, he received the prize, and he said, "Oh yes, I am in front of the professionals of the profession." And he hated them because he wanted not to become a professional. I think a good artist is not a professional. The question is the social status of the amateur. You have amateurs, like me, for example. I am an amateur. I try to be an amateur of philosophy. And I am paid for making what I love. The problem is, when you are paid for making what you love, you can become somebody in prostitution, you know. So how to avoid to prostitute yourself by becoming a professional? This is very difficult. This is the reason for which I said a lot of professors don't believe in that, they teach. And it is a big problem. This is one of the most difficult problems of the universities today, because we are living in a very difficult period for universities. We are in discredit. It's not only banks which are discredited, professors are too. And it is extremely difficult to reinvent a credit here. I believe that the credit is produced by amateurs, that is by love. And now, saying that, and it's an occasion for me to come back to the question of skills, because we had a discussion about this in the seminar, and after with Noel I discussed about this question, and I wanted to know what was at stake behind this question. I understood that it was a question of teaching, what to teach in an art school today. Personally, I believe that it is extremely important to teach techniques, but they are not skills for me. They are, if you have, for example, I believe that it is necessary for the Bildung, let's say, of an artist, for example, or somebody who is studying art in an art school. It is extremely important to study the material history of art, that is organological history of art. And this study is only possible not by theoretical and abstract apprehension of this, but by the interiorization by the body of this history. So personally, I was teacher for some times in an art school in France. And personally, I I think that it is necessary to give the occasions for the students of using, practicing all the materials of the history of arts. Now, this is not a question of skills for me. This is a question of materiality of knowledge, of technicity of knowledge. It is not a skill. A skill is without individuation. What you can learn as a skill is not produced by your own individuation. And this is the reason for which I avoid to use this term, skill. Now, about professionalization and amateurs, I believe that at the beginning, profession means credit and faith. When you profess something, there is a very good lecture by Derrida about this. When you profess something as a professor, it is because you believe in what you profess. To profess is a kind of faith. So what is a professional? He is someone who believes in what he does, or he makes. Now, the problem is that professionalization has become an economic question and status, an institutional status, with the Philisteinization of the bourgeoisie first, and after bourgeoisie, what I call the mafia. And today, the professionals are experts. They are not professionals, they are experts. He's an expert of contemporary art. That is, he is good for the market. This means he is good for the market. That is for the symmetry for me.
Okay. Thank you, Bernard. That closes our proceedings. On behalf of Noel, myself, and the Graduate School, thank you for coming out this evening on the wet night that it was in, and we may see you in the new year maybe for another event. Okay, thank you. Very good. These are not ours.